Okay, so in this lecture, mainly I'm going to configure router to R2, and in this lecture, right, I'm going to skip setting the password for the console port and remote connection VTY. Okay, so so just click R2, right, and go to CLI, and you have to be in the user exe, right? User privileged exe mode. And let's say show IP interface brief. And then you know that this router has 2 GB Ethernet interface and 2 serial port, right? And then for the go to configuration mode and change the name of the router to R2, right? And then no IP domain lookup, right? Okay. And then most important thing is just configure this interface. But as you can see, R2, right? If you look at the R2 has 2 serial port, S000 and 001, right? We have to configure both. For each IP address, and IP address for each serial interface is the first one, 000, it's 172.16.2.2, right? It's a 2.2. And the 192.168.1.2 is for the second serial port, S001. And then I'm going to set the clock rate for the second serial port, right? And then I don't have to, right? I don't have to set the clock rate for the serial port of R3, okay? So and then finally this router has the Ethernet port, the gigabyte Ethernet port, right? So I need to configure 3 interfaces of the R2. So let's take a look at the R2, right? The IP addresses of R2. Let's just configure the three interfaces, okay? Starting from the serial interface 000. So interface serial port 000, right? And then IP address 172.16.2.2, and then subnet mask, right? And then no shutdown. Okay, so now the status is up, right? And if you go back to the router 1, right? And if you look at the status of the serial port 000, now it's down, right? Because I have to, in order to make this to be up, right? I have to configure the serial port of R2. That way, both R1, right? The serial ports of both R1 and R2 will be activated, and then the status will be up for both serial port, right? So if you look at the R1, the first router, and you know that, just note that this is down, right? Oops. So R2, right? I'm going to assign the IP address, right? Let's see. Okay, so I have just configured the first one. Hold on. No shutdown. Okay, so this is for R2, right? So let's see. At this point, now it's probably should up. Let's see, because I have just activated the serial port. Just go back to okay. So and then let's say show IP interface brief. I think at this point the serial port is up because I have just finished configuring the first activate 000, right? So just go back to R1 first. And then I have not typed show IP interface brief, right? Show IP interface brief. Now I think it should be up. The interface, serial interface should be up. Yeah, the serial interface is up, right? So go back to R2 and then just type show IP interface brief for R2, and then now it's up, right? Okay. And when if you look at this the Cisco packet tracer, right? When things up, you see the green arrow, right? So that means now these ports are being activated, right? But if you look at the right, the another serial line, it still is a red, right? The arrow is still red, right? Okay. So that means this needs to be activated, right? Okay. So R2, and then I'm going to configure the IP address for the gigabyte Ethernet port, right? So go have to configuration mode, global configuration mode, right? And then I have to say interface gigabyte, the first gigabyte Ethernet port, and then I'll assign the IP address 172.16.1.1, right? And then subnet mask, and then a no shutdown. I have to, so I mean, no shutdown cannot be omitted, right? You must type no shutdown to activate like any port, like serial port as well as Ethernet port, right? No shutdown, now it's up. So let's look at this diagram. So now you see that this is green, right? Now it's green. Okay, then the last one, I'm going to configure the IP address for the serial port 001, which is this port, right? Okay, S001, right? And then also I'm going to set the clock rate. Okay, so go to R2, right? Interface, oops, exit, and then interface S001, right? And then IP address is 192.168.1.2, and then subnet mask information, right? 1.2, good. And then I'm gonna set the clock rate. Clock rate is question mark, oops. Okay, I misspelled clock rate, CLOCK rate. And among this, I'm going to choose 9600, okay? So 9600. Okay, then I'm going to activate no shutdown. Okay, I'm done, right? So let's type show IP interface brief. Yes, at this point, this Ethernet port is now is up, right? And the serial port 001 is up. However, the 001 is still down because I have to configure to make this up, right? Make this connection being activated, I have to configure 001 of R3, right? Okay, so okay, the last thing for R2, I want to show the routing table, show IP interface, show IP route. And you know the C, they said it's directly connected this network, right? And then the C is 172.16.2.0, also directly connected through the serial 000, right? And it has not yet shown the directly connected network for the serial 001 because that port has not been activated. Now the status is down, right? And the L means this interface, direct interface. Okay, so that's the IP address. L is a local interface, right? Okay, now, okay, so I'm done with the R2. In the next lecture, I'm going to configure, finally, I'm going to configure R3. Thank you.